Hello, and welcome back to Midnight Sleep Scientist. I'm glad you're here. Settle the room the way you like it. A corner lamp dimmed, a blanket drawn up, the small sounds of the night taking their places. Perhaps there is a fan tracing its quiet circle. Perhaps the window is slightly open, and the air carries a thread of coolness. This is a good hour for wandering gently, for putting things down, for letting the mind follow one warm idea through the dark. Tonight, that idea is our star. We will be unhurried together, drifting along the sun's long story, how it came to shine, how it keeps its balance, how it will someday change, and what remains afterward. We'll move from a familiar morning window to spans of time so wide they feel like weather on the scale of galaxies. The aim is not to chase detail, but to rest inside the outlines, like floating in a lake that knows the shape of the shore even when our eyes are closed. We might begin with the simple, home-like feeling of daylight on a table, a steady gold that has arrived without fail for every human who has ever opened their door at dawn. Then we'll wander inward to where hydrogen becomes helium and light becomes patience, to the long climb of photons that might spend hundreds of thousands of years finding their way from the sun's center to the surface. We'll feel for a moment the textured skin of the photosphere, a quilt of boiling granules as wide as countries. We'll listen for the magnetic music above it, the thin corona gleaming even when we look away. Later we'll step forward in time and imagine how our sky might soften and redden as the sun swells into a gentler, larger shape. We'll visit the brief lantern of a planetary nebula. We'll rest beside the small, dense ember that remains, our sun made quiet and white, enduring in a way that is less about fire and more about structure. A star that no longer burns, yet still holds. Along the way, we'll keep our language plain and our steps light. Where numbers might press too hard, we'll set them down. Where uncertainties remain, and there are many, we'll admit them softly and keep moving. Science here is not a drumbeat, but a tide, a rhythm that suggests rather than insists, that invites sleep rather than chases it away. For now, let your shoulders drop. Let the day recede like footprints in evening foam. The sun is still outside the dark. It has been still, in its way, for billions of years. It will carry on long after we've closed our eyes. There is comfort in that, a steady hearth in the great night. If you're still awake, you're welcome to share where you're listening from tonight. A city room, a sleeping train, a farmhouse under a patient sky. But you don't have to. The story is here, and it will hold you either way. When you're ready, we'll step to the window and see our star. We call it the sun, as though there were only one, and for us that's true. In the company of stars it is ordinary, middle-aged, middling in mass, quiet by the standards of fireworks in the galaxy, and yet it is the most intimate cosmic object in our lives. Its light knots the shadows under our chairs. Its heat rides the wind, becomes harvest, becomes wood smoke, becomes breath. If the night sky is a cathedral, the sun is the candle we carry from it, the small flame that lets us read the page. What is it, really? Perhaps we begin simply. The sun is a sphere of hot, ionized gas, a star balance between two desires, gravity's inward draw and heat's outward push. It shines because deep inside, hydrogen is being quietly reassembled into helium, and the difference in binding becomes energy, not in a rush, not with sparks, but with the patience of countless collisions. A choreography where protons meet, hesitate, transform, step by step releasing light. Picture a simple morning, the kind that has happened in more ways than there are names for light. A cup warming your hands, the edge of a curtain lifting slightly as the room brightens. The sun does not rise so much as our planet turns us into its face, and yet it feels personal, like being greeted. Past the radiative depths, the sun begins to boil in wide cells. Hotter gas rises, cooler gas falls. The surface we see, if surface is the right word for a place with no solid ground, is a living texture of granules, each a column of gas bringing heat from below. They shimmer and shift, a slow dance by our clocks, fast by the sun's. Between them, darker lanes where the gas cools and sinks. It is an ocean that never sleeps, a lake of light unbothered by shore. The light born there does not leap straight to our faces. It wanders. This is one of those places where time in the sun becomes soft and strange. The core is surrounded by a thick shell where light does not travel like an arrow, but like a secret passed slowly through a crowd. Absorbed, re-emitted, absorbed again, its direction changed each time. A single photon's journey might take, depending on the details we're still refining, on the order of hundreds of thousands of years to reach the surface. It is as though sunlight is an heirloom, crafted in a past our species did not yet know, and delivered to us every morning as something newly made. The core holds this dance. It is dense in a way difficult to hold in the mind. The temperatures are high enough that atoms are more like crowds than people. Nuclei and electrons parting and meeting, a plasma with its own rules. In this press and heat, hydrogen nuclei find one another, not easily. They repel, the way like charges do, but the conditions make room for brief embraces. A sequence of moves follows, some rare, some swift, and out of that sequence, a helium nucleus appears, and with it, photons of energy and neutrinos that slip away almost without noticing anything else exists. That wind, a stream of charged particles, blows constantly. It combs the heliosphere into a vast bubble, a cocoon within the galaxy's wider weather. The planets and their moons circle inside this breath, within a magnetic hush. When we turn our radios on, part of what we hear, faintly, is the sun's conversation with emptiness. Above this glowing skin, the air becomes thinner and stranger. The chromosphere, named for the color it shows during eclipses, flickers with spacules and waves. Higher still, the corona, the crown, flares outward in long pale streamers. It is counterintuitive, perhaps, that the corona is hotter than the layers beneath, a reminder that the sun's magnetic fields, braided and stressed by the boiling below, can dump energy where we least expect it. We live with these fields quietly. Most they arch and reconnect, snap and smooth, launching occasional storms that whisper across the solar system. On some days, particles rush outward and our own planet's magnetic shield gathers them in green and violet curtains. On others, the sun's mood is almost meditative, its wind steady, a faint breath filling the rooms between worlds. If you could touch it, you would not find anything to rest your hand upon. Yet there is structure, and we can name it the way we name rooms in a house to feel at home. Core, radiative zone, convection zone, photosphere, chromosphere, corona. The words are like stepping stones across a river. They do not tell the whole current, but they let us cross, and as we cross, something else becomes clear. The sun's steadiness is not the absence of change, but the balance of changes so numerous they cancel into calm. Think of the way a city can seem still at 3 a.m., even as lights switch in distant windows, even as a delivery truck murmurs past, even as a fox slips through the hedges. The sun's calm is like that, composed of many small events that add to a larger hush, the trembling of acoustic waves through its body, the slow shifting of magnetism that creates spots darker than their neighborhood, the gentle rise and fall of an 11-year rhythm as fields tangle and unknot. All of these are woven into daylight, so reliable we stopped noticing its complexity a long time ago. And it is friendly to think, here at the beginning, about how this light becomes our weather, our days, our sense of time. A photon that finally escapes the sun's surface takes about 8 minutes and some seconds to arrive. The quiet between those minutes is space itself, thin, black, generous. When the morning grows brighter at your window, what you are seeing is not only the sun as it was moments before, but the history of a journey that began before cities, before language, perhaps before the kind of trees you know had learned how to be themselves. This is not to make the light heavy, only to notice that it has depth, like a song learned from a grandparent's grandparent. We might pause now and glance at the ordinary corners of the room, the slippery line where shadow leaves the wall, the way a glass on the table holds a shard of fire at its base. All of this is the sun in conversation with matter, photons meeting electrons and being turned into warmth, energy arriving and being transformed into comfort, into bread, into the grass under the feet of a child learning to run. The sun is not only above us, it is in the wood of the chair, in the color of fruit, in the idea of new. There is, too, the way this star shapes our bodies and minds. Try to recall the last time you felt the season turn, the first afternoon in spring that smelled faintly of rain on soil, the soft surrender of a late autumn morning when the sun never climbs very high and everything seems to speak quietly. Our hormones and circadian clocks keep time with light. Our moods lean toward windows. Our stories place fires at the center of gatherings. To love the sun is in some small way to love the pattern of being human together. There are caveats. As always, we imagine the sun as perfectly spherical, but rotation and magnetism sculpt it subtly. We speak of cycles as though they were metronomes, while the sun, like any living system in nature's sense of living, wanders within patterns. We say fusion and think flame, but the processes are more like rules of crowd behavior than the theater of a candle. And when we describe layers, we are drawing lines across a blur for our own ease. None of this reduces the wonder. If anything, it frees us to hold the sun gently, not as a machine with simple dials, but as a stable, restless harmony. Perhaps you picture sailors before instruments, reading the sky with their bones, farmers moving with the length of days, painters working by north light to keep colors honest, solar panels tilting like sunflowers in a modern field. The same star has held them all, the same 8-minute gift arriving without receipt or signature, proving itself by the way it makes things grow. If you step outside at noon on a clear day, the sun seems like a coin too bright to look at, too near to be distant. But imagine standing instead at the edge of space, above the thinning air, and watching as the sun's light carves a crisp horizon on our small sphere. In that view, the sun becomes large again, truly large, and we see the truth: our world is a lit pearl in a gentle tide. The glare softens into geometry, the nearness reveals itself as grace. Under this steady gift, we often forget how far we live from the engine itself. 93 million miles, more or less, is a safe arm's length, a distance that turns dangerous radiance into daily kindness. Between us and the core's brightness, the sun and space have arranged a filter that makes life possible. Absorption, scattering, the way our air prefers some colors to others, the way ozone and clouds take their shares. Even the randomness of weather plays its part, fashioning a world where shade and light take turns as politely as dancers bowing. So we begin here, at the window, with the familiar, because the rest of the journey will widen. Later we will watch this ordinary star grow strange and beautiful in old age. We will see it redden, breathe out, thin itself into a lantern of gases. We will be kind to ourselves with the scales involved, remembering that these shifts are so slow that mountains have time to bow and oceans to move their furniture. We have time to sit with the idea, to let it become a friend rather than a worry. For now, it is enough to understand that the sun's life today is a dance in balance. Gravity folds inward, heat unfurls outward. The two meet, and for a very long time, agree. If you listen closely, there is a kind of parental quiet in that, a sense that the house is in order, the lamp is full, the night can be slept through. Let your jaw soften. Let the breath move the way clouds move, not counted, not commanded, simply there. When you open your eyes again, perhaps the room will seem slightly different, as though the walls have learned a new word, or perhaps it will be exactly the same, which is its own kind of comfort. Either way, the sun will be there when you need it, on the far side of your curtains, with its steady, generous patience. The photons that will arrive in the morning may already be on their last miles through the deep. The story is already on its way. In the next chapter, we will learn how stars keep time, and how a star's mass writes most of its future, but not yet. For now, the window is enough. The warm rim of your cup is enough. The artifact of 8 minutes is enough. Close your eyes if you like. The light can take care of itself. Imagine setting a clock on the mantel and watching not the hands but the quiet of the room they move through. Stars keep time in that way, by a hush made of balances, by a rhythm so steady we only notice it when we zoom out farther than any lifetime allows. Their calendars are not pages but pressures, not ink but light. Mass is their main appointment. A star's mass is the weight of its promise, and its limit, the number that sets how hot its center must become to push back against gravity. With more mass, the squeeze is greater. The core runs hotter. Fusion races. With less, the squeeze is gentle. The core warms more slowly, and time becomes spacious. The sun sits comfortably in the middle, large enough to glow with a bright, stable tone for eons, small enough to avoid the quick blaze and brief life of its more massive cousins. Inside, gravity pulls inward ceaselessly, folding gas toward the center. Heat pushes outward, not as a hand, but as a collective insistence. Particles colliding, photons being born and scattered, pressure translating into structure. This conversation between inward and outward is what astronomers call hydrostatic equilibrium. You can picture it as a handshake that is always being renegotiated, always firm, always kind. Fusion provides the warmth. In our sun, the dominant path is the proton-proton chain, a sequence in which hydrogen nuclei, protons overcome their like-charge reluctance and, through rare but decisive steps, become helium. Each step sheds energy, mostly as photons, a few as neutrinos that slip through the sun and space like whispers no wall can catch. If the rate of fusion rises a little, the core swells and cools, slowing the reaction. If the rate falls, the core contracts, heating the plasma and nudging fusion up again. A thermostat not by design, but by physics, steadying the household. Time here is not counted in seconds, but in fuel and luminosity. A rough, useful truth is that more massive stars shine disproportionately brighter, so much brighter that they burn through their stores in a fraction of the time. A heavyweight blue star can live a few million years, a blink at the scale of galaxies. A tiny red dwarf might sip its hydrogen for trillions. Our sun, measured against these extremes, is generously paced. It has been on the main sequence. This long middle chapter, where hydrogen in the core is turned into helium for about 4.6 billion years, and likely has around that much again before the balance tips toward age. Astronomers have a map for these lives called the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, a scatter of stars plotted by brightness and color. The main sequence slants across it like a riverbed, and our sun rests along that slant with countless neighbors, above and to the right. Elder stars, inflated and reddened. Below and to the left, small, cool stars holding tiny, stubborn fires. The diagram is not only a chart, it is a family portrait of energy and time. Within the sun, time shows itself in smaller rhythms too. Acoustic waves thrum through it, letting us listen to the star the way doctors listen to hearts. A field called helioseismology that reads the sun's interior from its surface tremors. An 11-year cycle knots and unknot its magnetic fields, dotting the photosphere with spots and arching the corona into brighter crowns. These are seasons on a stellar scale, weather of the deep interior manifesting as flickers and flares. They do not change the sun's total output by much, only by 1% or so, but they matter to the thin technologies we string across our planet, and to the auroral curtains at high latitudes that make winter nights feel like cathedral ceilings. The sun's timekeeping also shows up in the way light leaves. Photons, born in the core, scatter outward through the radiative zone, their path a slow diffusion that erases memory of any single starting point. What emerges at the photosphere is a distribution, the star's spectrum, telling us its surface temperature, its chemistry, the telltale fingerprints of elements warmed and jostled. From those clues we infer histories, what the sun was made from, which itself tells of older stars that enriched the cloud it formed out of. Time folds back on itself here, the present carrying a rumor of the past in its color. Beyond the physics, there is a gentler register, how a star's schedule becomes a planet's. The stable output of a middle-aged star gives a world like ours room to experiment. Oceans condense and stay. Atmospheres arrange themselves into patterns not entirely undone by heat. Life, if it flickers into being, is given long hours to try again and again. Time, in this sense, is not only duration, it is opportunity, the patience of conditions not flipping the table. Yet nothing stands entirely still. As hydrogen fuses, the core's composition changes. The helium ash is more compact. The mean weight of particles there increases. Gravity leans in a little more. The core contracts slightly, heats slightly, and fusion at the center brightens to hold the line. The sun, over vast spans, grows gently more luminous. Its clock is not a metronome, but a slow accelerando, imperceptible within any human story, obvious when you lay a billion years beside another. If you like, you can think of the sun as a hearth whose logs are subtly rearranged over time, embers drawn inward, flames adjusting to the pile. To sit by that hearth is to feel something changeless. To look closely is to notice the details, the eddies of air, the shapes of tongues of fire. The sun's time is like that, local calm born of tiny negotiations, long drift born of cumulative shifts. We live in the halo of this timing. The length of our day is set not by the sun, but by Earth's rotation. Yet our circadian clocks keep faith with light rather than ours. Our seasons come from the tilt of our axis, but their character, the warmth held in the skin of evening, the particular smell of a thaw, leans on how much sunlight arrives, and how the planet redistributes it. For tens of thousands of years, our orbits trace subtle cycles that reshuffle sunlight across latitudes. Ice grows and retreats in sympathy. Meanwhile, the sun, faithful and slow, brightens on scales longer than these dances, writing a long, quiet future for climate, even as weather continues to be its improvisation. If you step outside now, you can measure none of this. You will feel air, see shade, notice a bird's quick line across the sky. The sun's great clocks spin in the background like a city's grid of arteries feeding neighborhoods we never visit. And yet, knowing the clocks are there is a comfort. It says that the room we live in has beams, that the house is framed by something more durable than storm or season. The idea that mass is destiny might feel a little stern, but it is softened by how generous the destiny is for a star like ours. There is room in it for continents to drift, for languages to invent themselves and then gently change, for seas to draw down and return. There is room for us to learn the clocks, to fall asleep beside them without fear. Later in our journey, we'll step into the part of the story where the clocks reach a new hour, where the balance shifts and the sun changes its shape of giving. Before that, we can lean into the present, into the long middle that made us possible. The time is wide, the light is steady, the work of fusion continues, quiet as snowfall in the core. Let your shoulders loosen. Let your eyes half close if that feels kind. The star is keeping time for us. There is nothing to keep, nothing to hold, only the sense of being carried on a slow current. The shore steady, the water warm. There is a stone in the yard that remembers every summer. By early afternoon it has gathered enough sunlight to feel like a kept secret, warm under your palm even when a breeze threads the garden. Imagine that stone not only today, but across uncountable Julys, how it might learn, if a stone could learn, that noon grows a shade brighter with each passing age. The sun is not a fixed lamp, it is a living balance, and living balances tend to drift when their ingredients change. In the core, helium accumulates from the long patience of fusion. Helium weighs more per particle than hydrogen. So as it builds up, the core's mean weight increases. Gravity, always present, presses a little harder on that denser mixture. The core contracts slightly, the squeeze lifts the temperature and pressure just enough that fusion can proceed more briskly in the hydrogen that remains. The result at the surface is a small increase in luminosity. A noon that spread across a billion years grows about 10% brighter. For our senses, that change is too slow to feel, but for a planet, slow is not the same as insignificant. Over hundreds of millions of years, a gentler sun can mean ice sheets that breathe with the tilt of seasons and the sway of orbital cycles. Over billions, a brightening star begins to whisper differently to oceans and air. The conversation shifts from how shall we keep warmth to how shall we carry it away. We've already lived through the earliest chapter of this arc, when the sun was fainter than now. In Earth's beginnings, sunlight may have been dim by a third or more compared to the modern day, a puzzle often called the faint young sun paradox. Yet liquid water pooled and life, simple, then layered, took hold. How? Perhaps greenhouse gases were richer in that young air, with carbon dioxide and methane acting as blankets. Perhaps the planet's surface was darker and absorbed more. Clouds, aerosols, the shape of continents, the chemistry of the sky. each likely played its small part. The details are still a lively conversation among scientists, and the answer might be less a single key than a set of hinges that together allowed the door to swing. What matters for our nighttime story is the pattern. Our world seems to have a thermostat of its own, written in rock and rain. When the planet warms, weathering of silicate rocks may speed up, drawing carbon dioxide from the air and tucking it into ocean carbonates, a process that slowly cools things. When the planet cools, weathering slows. Volcanoes and seafloor vents continue to add CO2, gently increasing the greenhouse and warming things back. Over millions of years, this carbon silicate cycle might soften the sun's long brightening, nudging Earth toward the middle. It is not a perfect thermostat. It lags, it overshoots, it is shaped by the continents wandering, the opening and closing of seaways, the rise of plants. But as a tendency, it seems to prefer streams to stay liquid, to keep coastlines where life can braid itself tight. Still, there are limits. Extend the sun's brightening far enough into the future, and the thermostat runs out of room. As the star grows more luminous, the planet must reflect more or lose more heat to keep the same temperature. Lonelier clouds or brighter ice help, but they cannot counter every watt. The greenhouse gases we depend on become a delicate tuning knob. Too many and the world holds heat. Too few and plants struggle to breathe. Over hundreds of millions of years, weathering that draws down CO2 may tug it toward levels where some plant lineages, those that use a more ancient CO2-hungry pathway, find life harder. Other plants using thriftier chemistry may fare better for a while. Life adapts. Landscapes change their dominant greens. Push forward slowly, and the conversation tips. There comes a range of futures, not in our calendars but in Earth's, where incoming sunlight could exceed what the planet can quietly release, even with drier air and fewer greenhouse blankets. Before seas boil, a subtler shift may arrive, a moist greenhouse where the upper atmosphere holds more water vapor and sunlight breaks water molecules apart more easily. Hydrogen, light and quick, can escape to space. Oxygen may rust soils or find other partners. Over long spans, this trickle becomes a river. Oceans might shrink, clouds change their personalities, coastlines retreat into memory. The numbers for these thresholds arrive with hedges and careful error bars. Some studies suggest that within about 1 billion years of continued brightening, conditions for complex land life could wane. Within a few billion, oceans could thin. The order of events depends on many players: the arrangement of continents, the vigor of plate tectonics, the generosity of volcanic recycling, the behavior of clouds. No one fully knows how to predict at such distances. It is appropriate to speak softly here, because the uncertainties are honest, and the times are so vast that almost everything about the surface world will have changed many times over before these changes culminate. There is comfort tucked inside that vastness. The sun's warm noon is not a threat walking up the path to our door. It is a slow tide that future mountains will know better than we can. Even within that tide there are eddies. Orbital cycles will continue to shuffle sunlight among latitudes on tens and hundreds of thousand-year scales, inviting ice ages and thaws. Volcanoes will write short chapters of haze and clearing. The geomagnetic field will wander and flip. The moon, inching away, will lengthen our days so slowly that only seas and shorelines will notice for now. All of these are local notes in a symphony whose key, very gradually, modulates toward brightness. If we look beyond Earth, the warmer noon has other consequences. The inner edge of the sun's habitable zone, the gentle band around a star where liquid water could rest on a rocky world, slides outward with time. Worlds that are now cool may find a prolonged spring. Places now too close might become uncomfortably hot. Mars, which today leans cold and dry, could very far ahead briefly enjoy a milder temper under a redder day. Though its thin air and small heart make that season uncertain, the outer icy bodies wrapped in frost will notice too, though they live by other fires as well. Tidal heat, radioactivity, chemistry under shells of ice. Closer to home, a warmer noon also means the sun's outer layers change subtly. Its wind, its magnetic moods, the way its corona breathes. These shifts are minor in the near future, and our technologies are learning to stand with and around them. Satellites know to duck storms. Power grids learn to hymn in key. Over longer spans, as the sun steps toward later chapters, the wind will matter in other ways. It will carry away a little mass, easing the sun's gravitational hold, letting orbits widen. Even that is slow and small, a drift felt over eons. Perhaps it helps to return to the stone in the yard. You touch it at noon and feel what the sun has made of that morning. In late afternoon the warmth lingers, a private ember. What the stone cannot tell you is the slight difference between this year and the next, or the next and the one after. Those changes are finer than its memory. The earth and the sun are like that stone, and your hand partners in a quiet transfer, a conversation of heat and colour. The larger arc of brightening is real, but it exists at a scale of noticing that requires patience beyond any single witness. We borrow instruments and math to extend our senses into that scale, and they tell us a calm story. There is time, and then more time, and then some. In human terms, what shall we do with this knowledge? Perhaps only this. Treat the sun as the steady elder it is, and the planet as a home that keeps its own counsel. Be mindful of the climate we influence on the scales of decades and centuries. Those are our rooms to tend. Allow the far future to be a distant country where other minds, perhaps descended from ours, will walk with their own careful steps. The warmer noon is theirs to plan around. Our task under today's light is to live gently by it, to understand its gifts and limits, to keep the stone warm enough for the child who will touch it tomorrow. If your eyes are growing heavy, that is welcome. Let this chapter end as softly as it began, with a palm resting on sun-warmed stone, a breeze telling you which way the day has turned. The sun is brightening, yes, but tonight it simply sets. The sky cools, crickets begin their small applause, and the room you're in learns the shape of twilight, the way it always has. In the next part of our journey, we will step toward the hour when the core begins to change its mind, when hydrogen in the center runs thin and the outward push must find another way. Not yet. For now, breathe like waves arriving and going. The noon has passed. Evening is kind. Imagine a lantern in a winter room. Its flame steady as you read. Hours pass. The wick shortens, not all at once but thread by thread, and the flame, still bright, leans into a different kind of work, drawing fuel upward, changing shape so it can continue to give. Stars reach that hour too, not with worry, not with haste, but with a sure step into a new balance. Deep in the sun's heart, hydrogen has been slowly joining to become helium for billions of years. The result of that patience is a core increasingly made of helium ash, a word that feels misleading because this ash is not cold or spent. If anything, it is denser, more tightly bound. But helium, under these conditions, does not yet burn. It collects. The core grows heavier in the sense that each particle now carries more mass. Gravity, constant and intimate, leans in a little harder. What follows is not a collapse, not a drama with sharp corners, but a settling into a new posture. The helium core contracts slightly under its own weight. In contracting, it warms, as falling things often do when they crowd closer around this warming heart. The thin shell where hydrogen still lingers, just outside the core, finds its temperature sweetened into readiness. Fusion lights there. The house changes not because the stove in the kitchen goes out, but because the fire moves to the hearth. At first, the sun looks much the same to a quick glance across the galaxy. Yet inside, pressures are being renegotiated. The core contracts and heats. The shell around it fuses hydrogen faster than the old core did. Energy flows outward more freely, and the outer layers, far from the press, respond the way an evening curtain responds to a draft. They puff, they loosen, they step outward. The sun becomes larger, its surface cooler because the same warmth is now spread over a far wider skin. The color shifts toward a softer red, and shadows lengthen in a way that would make every afternoon feel like autumn. On a diagram of stellar lives, the family portrait we mentioned before, the sun leaves the main sequence and ambles to the right, and upward, toward what astronomers call the subgiant branch, and then the red giant branch. Names are less important than the feeling a star that was compact, and white gold becomes swollen and warmer hued, not as a fever but as a quilt. For a very long time, by our measure, the star brightens, expands and brightens again. The music changes slowly. The envelope, now far from the hot interior, becomes easier to stir. Convection, those wide rising and falling currents, reaches deeper, dredging material that has been processed just enough to carry new stories in its mix. Subtle changes in the proportions of carbon, nitrogen and oxygen appear at the surface, a gentle confession that things are different underneath. The star's magnetic habits shift with its new size and structure. The rhythm of spots and flares is not the old familiar one, and the wind grows. Not a gale all at once, but a thicker breath. Particles walking away from the surface in numbers that begin to matter to the star's future. Out where orbits keep time, these breaths matter too. As the sun loses mass, very slowly, its gravitational hold eases. Planets feel this as a loosening of the leash. Their paths widen, a little at first, and then a little more. The dance floor grows, even as the partner at the center swells. Two changes pull in opposite directions. Expansion of the sun and expansion of the orbits. Fate will be written in their difference, as well as in subtler details. Tides raised in both star and planet. Drag from the star's extended atmosphere. Magnetic conversations that for worlds very near become intimate. Mercury, close and small, has always been a sprinter hugging the inner lane. In the sun's later stages, there is little room for it to survive as it was. Venus, second and clouded, circles closer than comfort allows when the sun's face grows wide. The Earth's story at this hour is a soft uncertainty. Some calculations suggest that as the sun puffs outward, the orbit's slow widening may not be enough. That friction and tides could draw our world inward into air too hot to forgive. Other models allow a sliver of escape, a world scorched and remade, but not swallowed. The split between these fates depends on exact winds, exact tides, exact timing, and the way the sun's envelope behaves as it brushes the edge of a planet's day. If that sounds like a lot to hold, it is all right to set it down. The times involved are hundreds of millions, then billions of years from now. Mountains that have not yet risen will have time to stand and wear smooth. The continents will be strangers to one another. The moon will have drifted farther, stretching our days into hours long enough to feel like a doze in summer shade. No calendar we know will recognize the dates. There is a human way to sense these changes that does not require the arithmetic. Picture the sky of the far future as told in myth more than in numbers. Daylight warms to a deeper honey. Sunrises grow into slow, fruit-colored swells. The disk at noon looms larger, its light less harsh, more like a lantern behind gauze. The seasons are not what our farmers would call them. The word season itself might have become poetry rather than agriculture. If any beings stand under that light, they will have made peace with new rules and different grasses, or they will stand indoors and watch, as we do now, through clever glass. Inside the star, the quiet drama continues. Hydrogen shell burning builds helium onto the core like rings added to an old tree. The core grows more massive, more compact, more hot, yet paradoxically, it remains unable to fuse helium as it is. In stars of the sun's size, electrons in the core have become so crowded that a new kind of support, Euchin and stubborn, holds the line. This degeneracy pressure, as physicists call it, props the core like a silent pillar that does not care about temperature in the ordinary way. Heat rises in the core as it contracts, but the pressure does not respond by expanding and cooling as a normal gas would. The result is a kind of loaded stillness. Energy added does not slacken the squeeze. Instead, it builds toward a threshold. The star's radius, in this first ascent toward redness, can grow to dozens, then hundreds of times its current size. Not all at once, not smoothly, but in long, generous motions. The outer layers cool to temperatures that would look orange-red to anyone with eyes to see. The luminosity climbs, astonishingly bright compared to today, even though each square meter of surface is cooler, because there is so much more surface radiating. Think of a loaf of bread. Thin slices cool quickly. A whole round holds warmth and gives it off in grander style. What does such an enormous star feel like from within? It is as if gravity's whisper has become a low, constant hum, and heat answers in a deeper register. Currents roll through the envelope like weather patterns the size of orbits. The star's thin outer air makes room for dust grains to grow, little seeds of mineral and carbon that sunlight can push. Where dust forms, light finds a sail. The wind thickens, and that wind carries away story and substance in equal measure. The star is beginning to share itself with the dark between stars. For the sun, this subgiant and early red giant evolution unfolds across hundreds of millions of years. Along that slope, its wind will strip away a small but meaningful fraction of its mass. Later, the wind will strengthen into a true exhalation. The balance of forces will right the precise path of expansion. Close-in worlds will feel not only heat, but touch. Farther worlds, Mars and beyond, will feel warmth. As a long spring, perhaps briefly hospitable in ways they never were for us. We are sifting ahead, now toward the moment when the loaded stillness in the core is resolved. Helium, finally hot enough, will feel the sudden opening of a locked door. The change will not be a surface spectacle, so much as a deep rearrangement, and it will calm the sun for a time, shrinking it back from its most swollen state, tightening its light into a new color. That chapter is soon. For now, what matters is the sense of a slow turning of a page. It is natural here to glance again at home, our own century's concerns, the weather that visits our towns, the climate that threads decades, live on a different floor of this house. The far future widenings and warmings are a backdrop so distant that they are not a reason for haste, only an invitation to wonder and perhaps to a kind of humility. The sun is generous and patient beyond us. We can borrow its patience just a little to rest tonight. If your eyes are heavy, let them be. The core is growing quiet in one way and gathering itself in another. Between those truths lies a great softness, the sense of a being that knows its work and is not afraid to change how it does it. Imagine a garden at dusk, when colors deepen and edges blur. The same plants seem larger, their leaves wider, their shadows velvety and kind. The sun's red giant stage is like that dusk familiar light, made generous and strange. Under it, a new kind of weather grows, and even the emptiness between worlds sprouts structures made of breath and dust. As the hydrogen-burning shell burns on, and the envelope swells, the sun becomes a great, cool flower. Its surface, spread across an immense sphere, settles at temperatures that would feel warm rather than scalding if you could stand impossibly near. The photosphere blushes toward copper. The chromosphere lifts its ragged veil. The corona, still hot and mystical, stretches in ghostly fingers much farther than before. The whole star is a lantern wrapped in gauze, and yet it shines with a brightness that would make our current noon seem a pocket watch held up to a cathedral clock. Inside this lantern, convection deepens. The star's vast cells of rising and sinking gas become the main carriers of heat through most of the envelope. With each cycle, that churning brings small traces of processed material up from regions where hydrogen fusion has shuffled elemental cards. It is as if the star is stirring its own soup, and the ladle reaches a little deeper than before. At the surface, astronomers expect to read slight enrichments in helium and nitrogen, and changes in the ratios of carbon's isotopes, a quiet chemical memoir of the star's interior kitchens. The wind thickens. In the tenuous outer layers, atoms join into small molecules. At slightly greater remove, grains condense. For a star like the sun, the dust will be rich in silicates, tiny glassy bits born in a warm twilight. Light, which carries momentum as surely as it carries color, begins to push on these grains. The grains nudge the gas. The push becomes a flow. What began as a whisper is now a steady out-breath, a stellar breeze, growing into a true wind that carries away mass. This mass loss is not a loss in the spirit of misplacing, it is a gift outward. The dust and gas streaming away will, over unimaginable distances and times, join the general wealth of the interstellar medium, the raw material for future stars and planets, the nursery where chemistry becomes geology and geology becomes biology. The red giant garden, then, is a seed house too. In its beds, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and silicon are wrapped into forms that survive the journey. The garden sheds seeds by the billions, and the dark, far fields are patient. Closer to the star, the wind does other work. It bumps against the material already out there. The older, thinner solar wind, the fields and flows that map the heliosphere, and carves shells, arcs, and bow waves. Imagine, if you like, translucent petals around a light, each petal the fossil of a gust. If we could step back and watch at speeded time, we would see waves moving through these shells the way breezes ripple through grain. And what of the worlds in this light? Mercury is by now a memory, a metal bead melted into the star's breath. Venus likely follows, its past secrecy swallowed by a day without room for clouds. The Earth's fate, as we admitted, is a soft maybe. If by some kindness of dynamics our world's orbit keeps it just outside the sun's reddest skirts, it is still transformed beyond recognition. Oceans, if any linger, are shallow ghosts. The atmosphere is an altered script. The continents have been reshuffled by moods of rock we cannot foresee. Perhaps only the outline of the planet remains familiar, a sphere marked by extinct ridges where plates collided under a sky that is more window than air. Yet, even as inner rooms change or empty, the outer house finds a strange hospitality. Mars, long cold, may warm into a season that paints its highlands darker and lets brines breach old salts. Distant moons, Europa, Enceladus, Titan, feel a gentler sun, their surfaces, once the domain of frost and haze, learn new albedos, new conversations between light and chemistry. If Titan keeps its air orange and thick, sunlight could play a different kind of chord across its methane lakes. None of these changes promise gardens like ours, only experiments brief by stellar standards, but generous by human ones. Beyond the big moons lie belts and swarms, the asteroids, the cold Kuiper objects, the comets with their long, patient leashes. In the red giant day, ices that have slept for billions of years wake at greater distances. Sublimation becomes a slow breath rather than a sudden flame. Comet billow, tails unroll, not as fireworks but as veils. The solar system's edge, where the wind once faltered against the galactic breeze, balloons outward as the wind's character changes. The boundary is redrawn, and the old map looks quaint. All the while, within the star, the clock continues to wind. The helium core, held up by degeneracy pressure, grows toward a threshold where its temperature can nudge the next door open. This hour, still ahead in our story, will come as a rapid ignition of helium fusion, a flash that is fierce in calculation and gentle in narrative. From the garden's perspective, it is the moment when the gardener pauses, tightens a knot, and then continues in a more measured way. The star will contract somewhat, its color sharpen toward yellow-white, its luminosity ease. For a time, the sun will resemble a younger version of itself, though larger and wiser, burning helium into carbon and oxygen at its center, while hydrogen continues its work in a surrounding shell. But we are not there yet. We are strolling, slowly, between the tall stems of a star's late spring. The air is full of motes dust grains, catching light in angles that make halos around our imaginings. The path underfoot is not stone or soil, but mathematics, handled softly. You can hear, if you listen, the sound of leaving atoms slipping away in streams, molecules turning on their axes like seeds in a current. The star is becoming porous in the gentlest way, letting its past and its future mingle in the space around it. Timescales in this garden remain long by our calendar, though shorter than the star's long youth. The climb up the red giant branch, for a sun-like star, takes hundreds of millions of years, not thousands. The changes we describe as rapid would outrun civilizations, but not continents. In that sense, the garden is generous to patience and indifferent to hurry. It invites one to sit, to watch petals open over geologic afternoons. There is, as always, room for humility. Our models of these stages have grown careful through decades of listening to star clusters and distant giants, through reading spectra and counting pulsations, through matching theory to the tear-shaped tracks that stars leave on diagrams when they age as a group. Yet the sun is an individual, with its own rotation story, its own magnetic knots, its own subtleties in composition. When it becomes a red giant garden, it will follow the family path, but step with its own gait. We can say the season, we cannot annotate every leaf. If you are still with me, eyes perhaps half closed, let this chapter settle like evening. Picture a flowered tree against a red gold sky. Some leaves are letting go, not in loss, but as part of the tree's way of being generous to wind and soil. The ground will be richer for it. The air will carry their shapes farther than you can walk tonight. Soon, in our wander, the tree will feel a spark in its heart, a new fire catching in old wood. The sun will tighten, steady, and for a time glow with a whiter face. But that is the next path. For now, rest among these tall stems. Feel the slow wind on your skin. A wind made of star. Notice how it does not rush, how it simply continues, like a lullaby that knows when to repeat a line. Let your breath match it, unforced, uncounted, going where it needs to go. The garden will be here when we return. There is a hush before certain changes, a sense of breath held, the room listening to itself. The sun will know that hush, after its first long widening, after hydrogen moves from the core to a thin, hard-working shell, and the envelope unfurls like a slow banner. Something gathers at the center. The core, packed with helium and supported by that odd quantum stubbornness, continues to heat as it contracts. Pressure in that degenerate state does not yield to temperature the way we expect. Heat climbs without buying relief. The loaded stillness deepens. Then quietly to the eye, decisively to the physics, the door opens. We call it the helium flash, a phrase that sounds like fireworks, though nothing explodes into space, and no sudden blaze would be seen from a safe distance. It is more like striking a match in a sealed, cold cabin, and finding the stove already full, the room changing from the inside out, before a draft even shivers the curtains. In the sun's core, as temperatures crest close to 100 million degrees, helium nuclei, alpha particles, begin to join in a triple step. Two become unstable, beryllium, that would ordinarily fall apart at once. But in this press there is always a third partner near, and together they tip into carbon, releasing energy. The process is delicate and improbable when cool. In this heat it becomes possible, and then eager, because degeneracy pressure does not care about temperature. The first heat added does not let the core expand and cool in the usual self-regulating way. The reaction runs away for a brief stellar moment, a chain of small avalanches within the core that swiftly lift temperature. Yet brief here is still long by human clocks, minutes into hours, into perhaps days, and the core does not shatter or burst. Instead, the heat is enough to lift degeneracy, to restore the ordinary link between heat and expansion. The core swells slightly, cools slightly, and the runaway calms into a new, honest furnace. Steady helium fusion at the center, not a flash anymore, but a candle that holds. From outside, the star's response is a soft reversal. A sun that had climbed the red giant branch and spread itself thin now draws in a little. Its luminosity eases, its color sharpens toward a warmer white. On the astronomer's portrait, the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, our star settles into what's called the red clump, a cluster of points where stars of similar mass burn helium quietly in their cores. The quiet is important. For a time, perhaps 100 million years or so, the sun will be an older, larger, but once again stably balanced star, now powered by a new recipe: helium to carbon and oxygen within, hydrogen to helium without, two shells of fire with different flavors feeding a single light. Inside this new balance, the core's work is different, but no less patient. The triple alpha process stitches helium into carbon. Some carbon captures another helium and becomes oxygen. The proportions depend on temperature, on density, on the exact conditions of the moment. Little preferences that will matter later, when only ash remains. Convection does not reach the core. The products pile up in place, a small bright library storing future elements on its shelves. Around that library, the hydrogen-burning shell continues, and the envelope breathes with convection cells the size of planets. This phase, helium burning in the core, is a lullaby between crescendos. It will not last as long as the sun's hydrogen-burning youth, because helium holds less energy to be had per nucleus, and because conditions are hotter and more demanding. Still, Measured against any human era, it is long enough for mountains to grow and be shaved smooth, for new oceans to write coastlines, for the slow syllables of geology to change their accent entirely. If someone could somehow stand under that steadier, whiter light, someone far in the future with stories we cannot imagine, they might find comfort in how familiar it feels. Days are still days. The star's face is less swollen. The garden of dust and wind around it quiets a little. Even the outer worlds might notice a pause in the warmth that had been rising. In the margins of this calm, the star's chemistry continues to tell small truths. The envelope's convection carries faint signatures of interior processing to the surface, then out into space via the thin wind that never truly stops. Atoms show up in ratios that whisper of temperatures we will never touch, of densities we will never feel. Telescopes someday may read these whispers from other red clump stars and think of our sun aging with grace. Inevitably, the shelves in the core fill, helium dwindles. Carbon and oxygen, sturdy, simple, cherished by later chemistry, take its place. For stars significantly more massive than the sun, a new door might open: carbon fusion, heavier fires, a march toward elements forged in deeper pains. But our star is smaller. Its center will not grow hot enough to light carbon. The library locks at carbon and oxygen. When helium in the core is exhausted, fusion stops there, and the balance again tilts toward contraction. But now the sun has learned a new trick. Instead of a single flame or a single shell, it grows two. A helium-burning shell just outside the inert carbon-oxygen core, and outside that, a hydrogen-burning shell. The structure resembles an onion written in fire. Quiet center, ring of helium fusion, ring of hydrogen fusion, and then the vast convective envelope. This is the beginning of the asymptotic giant branch. The second great swelling, a return to redness that carries the star into its most generous season of giving. The word asymptotic comes from the way stars' tracks on the diagram approach a line without crossing it, as if the path is leaning toward a horizon. It feels appropriate here, the sun leaning toward an ending that is generous rather than abrupt. On the AGB, the star's life becomes punctuated. The helium shell does not burn as steadily as the core once did. It pulses over tens of thousands of years. Fuel builds and lights, then wanes. Each thermal pulse puffs the star, enriches the envelope with newly minted carbon, and strengthens the wind. The surface chemistry shifts again. In some stars, the balance of carbon and oxygen at the surface can tip, letting carbon-based dust, sort of a very beautiful kind, condense in the outflow. These carbon stars look rubied by eye, their spectra crowded with the signatures of molecules that will one day seed complex chemistries in cold clouds far away. Whether our sun becomes fully carbon-rich at the surface is a question that invites hedging. Its mass and metallicity may keep it on the oxygen-rich side, gifting silicate dust rather than carbon dust to the dark. The pulses will still come, the wind will still thicken, the envelope will grow more porous, more easily detached. Between pulses, the star will find brief calm. During them it will exhale strongly, like a sleeper turning in bed and sighing in their dreams. All of this is slow and kind. By our measures, the AGB may last only a few million years, short compared to the eons before. But across those millions, the sun will let go of a significant fraction of itself, casting off shells and drifts of gas at speeds that seem like walking at the scale of light. The solar system will be redrawn again, orbits widen further as the mass at the center lessens. The inner rooms empty, the outer rooms glow. We are approaching the part of the story where the star becomes visible air, where what was once private interior becomes luminous cloud. The pulses build toward a farewell that looks like a lantern lit from within. The core, now a nearly naked carbon-oxygen ember, will soon be revealed, and will, for a short cosmic while, shine so fiercely in the ultraviolet that the lost breath around it glows like stained glass. But we will not hurry. The sun has found a new elder steadiness in helium burning. Then learn to sing in pulses on the AGB. These are not alarms, they are chapters. If your eyes are heavy, let them close for a moment, and picture a hearth where two rings of flame burn, an inner blue and outer gold. The room is warm. The curtains lift a little in a draught. The night outside is large and patient. Soon we will step into the shell of remembered light. There is a winter habit some families keep, saving breath on a cold window, drawing small shapes in the fog that bloom and then fade. The sun's late gift to the sky is like that, except the breath is made of elements. The window is space itself, and the bloom brief by star standards will be visible across half a galaxy. Near the end of the AGB journey, the sun's outflow swells into a true shedding. Pulses grow more insistent. Dust grains form in abundance, catching light the way tiny sails catch wind. The envelope, now lightly bound, peels away in layers and veils. The outflow is not a single gust, but a sequence of departures, each one slightly different in speed and direction, shaped by convection cells the size of worlds, by magnetic fields knotted in the envelope, perhaps by the quiet tug of any companion that might drift near enough to stir the air. We do not know every sculptor's name. Observations of other stars in this hour show arcs and spirals, shells nested like the rings in a tree, and sometimes faint jets as if a hidden hand had pinched the dough and twisted. The core remains, wrapped only in a thinning cloak, freed of weight. It contracts and heats. Its surface temperature climbs with astonishing speed compared to the previous chapters, thousands, then tens of thousands of degrees, then more, until the core, no longer a core but a small fierce star, floods its surroundings with ultraviolet light. That light falls on the shucked-off envelope and turns it into a lantern. Atoms ionize, electrons lifted briefly away. When those electrons fall back, they release photons in specific colors, lines that give planetary nebulae their signature glows, the green of doubly ionized oxygen, the soft reds of hydrogen, the blues and violets of helium. The air of a star becomes visible the way a cathedral becomes blue when moonlight falls through stained glass. Planetary nebula is a misnomer born of telescopes that were still learning to see. Early astronomers, peering through small lenses, found these objects round and neat, resembling planets in their eyepieces. They are not planets, of course, but the name stayed, perhaps because there is a kind of planetary intimacy in them, a sense of a star's private weather becoming public art. Not all around. Many show bipolar shapes, hourglass lobes, rings with dark wastes, S-shaped jets, even delicate filaments like handwriting. Shapes are stories, and the storytellers could include rotation, magnetic fields, and very often companions. A hidden nether, bound in a long ellipse, can stir the outflow into spirals. A close partner, skimming the envelope, can carve a waist and channel the wind into twin plumes. Sometimes we find the companion later, a small dot near the bright hot center. Sometimes we infer it from the symmetry of the nebula, the way a sculptor's chisel marks betray their hand. For a sun-like star, the entire spectacle is brief and generous, on the order of 10,000, perhaps 20,000 years at full bloom, before the gas thins and fades into the general night. That brevity is part of their beauty. They are fireworks whose embers take centuries to dim, lanterns whose paper slowly becomes air. While they live, they give back with interest. The ultraviolet from the core pumps energy into the surrounding atoms and molecules, forcing them to sing in characteristic notes that carry across hundreds or thousands of light years. In those notes, astronomers can hear the elemental balance of the star's last gifts. How much oxygen and nitrogen, how much neon and sulfur, how much carbon dust. The nebula is a census of a life well lived. Seen from a nearby world, if any world could linger safely at such a time, the sky would be remade. Nights would hold a blossom of color around the overbright heart of the former sun. Petals expanding slowly year by year. Even days would feel different, suffused with blue-white light from a source sharper and smaller than before. Shadows would carve themselves with a new precision. The air, if any air remained, would sizzle with ultraviolet that no living skin could serenely bear. It is beautiful to imagine and sobering to inhabit. The vision is for poetry. The practicality belongs to physics. From our actual vantage, far, safe, reflective, we can dwell in the poetry. We can imagine wandering the shell with our minds, tracing where the last thermal pulse puffed extra carbon into a ring, where the wind caught a clump and tugged it into a teardrop, where filaments shadowed regions behind them the way clouds shade fields, shock fronts, where a faster gust overtook an older, slow one, might glow a little more strongly in certain lines. Knots may harbor tiny concentrations of molecules, places where future dust will grow and eventually ride a larger wind between the stars. At the center, the star that was the Sun is now a white dwarf in the making. A carbon-oxygen ember, Earth-sized, held up not by heat, but by the quantum pressure of electrons unwilling to share the same small spaces. In this very hot infancy, hundreds of thousands of degrees, it continues to radiate strongly in the ultraviolet, keeping the shell luminous. Over time, as it cools and dims, the nebula's glow will soften. The petals fray into space, the blossom goes transparent and then is gone, its material mixed into the interstellar medium, where it will become part of larger clouds that will someday contract, and in some corner, spark new stars. There is a deep kindness in this recycling. The carbon in our bones, the oxygen in our breath, the calcium in our teeth, none of these were forged in the quiet heart of a sun-like main sequence star. They were made in elder furnaces, in helium-burning cores and in shells, and then shared, first as winds, then as nebulae, sometimes as the more violent gifts of larger stars. We are, in that precise and literal sense, made of remembered light. The phrase is not metaphor so much as inventory. Questions remain, and it is good to hold them softly. How exactly does the sun's outflow assemble its final shapes? Will a hidden companion matter? We do not know of any large planet or small star hugging the sun close enough to carve a narrow waist. Yet smaller companions or distant giant planets could still play a role. Their orbits widen during the giant phases, their gravities writing faint signatures in the leaving air, magnetic fields, woven into the envelope by the star's own rotation, might guide the wind into lobes. The balance of dust types, silicates or carbon, will alter how light pushes. Each planetary nebula is an answer to a question we are still learning how to ask. The timescales comfort us again. If the sun's nebula will bloom long after any calendar we could hold, then we are free to admire others in the meantime. In small telescopes, the ring nebula hangs like a delicate hoop. The dumbbell spills light in two soft lobes. The helix stares like a great, pale iris. Through spectrographs we hear their chemistry. Through models we test our intuitions. Through space telescopes we find structures far subtler than our early names implied. In each, a star once like our sun wrote its farewell with light. After the lantern fades, what remains is not absence, but focus. The white dwarf, small, dense, quiet, waits at the center like a thought that persists after a conversation ends. It will be our next companion, the ember phase. The little star that shines without fire. Its cooling will take longer than the history of language, longer than any story we know how to tell without borrowing mathematics. But that is the next chapter. For now we stand in the colored air and listen. We might, before we leave, return to the room we're in. Perhaps a streetlight slips through the blinds, laying pale bars across the wall. Perhaps a car passes, and for a moment the ceiling blooms in a soft reflection that fades as quickly as it came. The planetary nebula is a cosmic version of that passing bloom, brief, luminous kind. It is not a loss, it is a sharing. The star has finished one way of being, and by letting go, has made beauty and material for others. Let your breath slow with the petals. Imagine a coal from a campfire, raked aside at the end of the night. No flame remains, yet the coal glows, its heat a quiet memory, its light a soft insistence. Now make the coal the size of a world, and make its memory the work of a star. That is the feeling of a white dwarf. After the lantern hour, the planetary nebula blooming and thinning, the sun's core stands revealed. It is small by stellar standards, roughly the size of Earth, yet it carries more than half the sun's original mass. Surface gravity on such an object is enormous. A tossed pebble would fall as though the ground had remembered it too strongly, but the weight is not held by heat. No fusion burns here. The keeping force is stranger and more intimate. The quiet refusal of electrons to share the same small places. Physicists call this degeneracy pressure, born from the Pauli principle that says identical fermions, electrons among them, cannot occupy the same quantum state. Squeeze matter hard enough that atoms overlap, and the electrons wave nature's crowd, but cannot pile. Their resistance isn't a pushing in the ordinary sense. It is a structural no, in a white dwarf, that no becomes architecture. Gravity leans in, electrons set their feet. The result is a balance like a thought held perfectly still. The star that is not quite a star anymore begins its new life, far too hot for comfort. Having contracted from a giant's airy envelope to a compact ember, it radiates prodigiously at first, bluish-white, a needle-bright point. Its light is the leftover heat of gravitational collapse and of the recent furnaces, helium burning, shell burning, now stilled. No new fuel is lit. Cooling is the future, and it will be a future counted in ages. At the surface, the chemistry separates into a poem of layers. The white dwarf's gravity is so strong that heavier elements sink swiftly, lighter ones float. If any hydrogen remains, it drifts to the top and becomes a thin, pure skin, only meters to kilometers deep, yet enough to dominate the spectrum we would read. If hydrogen is gone, helium takes that role. Beneath, carbon and oxygen form the heartwood. The star's face, then, is simple: hydrogen or helium, while its body is the ash of its former life. For a while, neutrinos carry away heat from the dense interior, tiny, whiskered messengers, departing almost as soon as they are made. Later, photons take over the cooling work, climbing through the opaque layers, passing their energy outward. As the white dwarf cools further, something exquisite happens inside. Ions settle into a lattice. The matter, already exotic, begins to crystallize. The star forms a heart of ordered carbon and oxygen, a diamond-like interior growing outward over time. Crystallization releases latent heat, slowing the cooling. Another patience in an already patient story. In the silence of its little atmosphere, gravity writes quickly. If a trace of iron or calcium appears at the surface, it cannot stay unless something keeps supplying it. Astronomers peering at other white dwarfs have found just such traces, metals that should have sunk but haven't yet. The likely culprits are the remains of old planetary systems, asteroids ground to dust by tides, comets tugged into fatal ellipses, rings of debris whispering down into the star's thin air. A polluted spectrum becomes a confession, proof that rocks once circled here, that a system survived its own endings enough to feed its ember crumbs. Our sun's white dwarf, when it arrives, will begin hot and bright, by dwarf standards, then wander down a long, graceful slope in temperature and luminosity. In 1 billion years, it will be cooler, in 10 billion cooler still, far beyond any calendar we would keep, far beyond the current age of the universe. Its glow will soften toward invisibility. Astronomers have a word for such an end state: a black dwarf, a white dwarf cooled to the point of darkness. But the universe is too young to have made even one. The idea is less observation than promise, a horizon too distant to resolve. There is a limit to what degeneracy can support. The more massive a white dwarf, the smaller it must be, electrons pushing back more fiercely as gravity presses harder. Increase the mass enough and even electron pressure will yield. Collapse would continue to stranger states. For the sun, this limit is comfortably distant. Its final ember will rest well below that threshold, content to be small and very sure of itself. What would it be like to stand at a safe distance from such an object, if standing near a gravity like that can be imagined kindly? The light would be sharp, shadow casting even when the star is dim. Because the source is compact, color would shift with time, from brilliant white blue to warm white to a red that softens into infrared, eventually into the near silence of longer wavelengths. If a planet could circle in the small, close-in habitable band that sometimes forms around cooling white dwarfs, a narrow ring where a world might receive just enough warmth, it would need to keep company carefully. Tidal forces would be strong. The world would likely lock one face to its sun. Early stages would be bathed in ultraviolet, better suited to minerals than to skins. Later, there might be a gentler, ember-lit evening that lasts eons. We should leave such imaginings with soft hands that moving a planet into such a ring without breaking it is a problem for civilizations far steadier than ours, and the sun's earlier outbursts would have scoured nearby space. In a larger way, the white dwarf is a teacher of limits. It says, A star can shine without burning, for a while by surrendering to structure. It says, not all endings are catastrophes, some are distillations. It says the matter that once sang as fusion can learn a new song, quiet, crystalline, enduring, and it speaks to memory. In the metals that sometimes stain a dwarf's spectrum, we read the last traffic of a remnant system, an asteroid's sigh, a ring's slow inward drift, the ghost of a comet crossing the furnace and becoming part of the ember's face. The white dwarf does not call these visitors, gravity simply waits. In waiting, it gathers stories. If you are drifting towards sleep, let this object become small in your mind's eye, a bead of hard light on black velvet, nothing around it, for a long while. Then the faintest haze of history, a ring, a few stones, a far pale planet that circles as though remembering a dance it learned as a child. The bead cools very slowly. The velvet remains. The feeling is not of loss, but of settling. We will stay near this ember a little longer, because what orbits do in its presence tells us something beautiful about loyalty and change. The music that held the planets in time with the sun has quieted. After the music, orbits find new shape. When a song ends, sometimes the last note hangs in the air, and the room keeps it alive for a breath. The solar system will have a coda like that. The great orchestration of the sun's youth, its steady tempo, its bright phrases, gives way to the quiet of an ember. In that quiet, the dancers do not vanish. They rearrange. Orbits are agreements between motion and mass. While the sun was shedding its outer layers, its mass dwindled gently. Every planet felt the difference, the way a kite feels a wind that is a shade softer. Over those long shedding years, paths widened. For most worlds, the change was adiabatic, so slow compared with their year that they simply stretched, their shapes not much altered. Eccentricities might grow a little, inclinations might tilt a whisper, but the rhythm held. Now the shedding is done. At the center sits an Earth-sized star with a sun's deep name. Its mass, perhaps, a little over half the original's. Its pull lighter but focused. Gravity's reach is the same. Its strength has changed. The family of survivors, outer planets, distant belts. The long dreaming Oort cloud now circles a smaller fire. Imagine standing far out among the slow movers, objects of the Kuiper belt and beyond. The white dwarf is a point, too bright to look at, but clearly small. Its light arrives clean, almost like frost. Out here, feeble sunlight was once supplemented by the faint ambient glow of a giant's diffuse corona, and by a heliosphere's buffeting wind. Those additions are gone, or changed. The dwarf's wind is thin. The heliospheric bubble has collapsed into something tighter and more muted. The empire of comets feels less pressure from within and more from without. Galactic tides, passing stars, the murmur of the galaxy's magnetic fields. Some of these far-flung bodies will loosen and slip away, unbound by the lighter central mass. Others will find their orbits nudged into new corridors that carry them inward, not in a spray, but as a patient drizzle of long-period comets heading toward the ember. Closer in, the giant planets, if they remain, are the grand conductors now. Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. Their names may not fit their future selves if the ages have cracked them or traded their clothes, but their gravities will still sweep, herd and scatter. Without the sun's old mass, their ratios of influence change. Resonances that once organized the asteroid belt into quiet and empty lanes might shift, inviting some fragments to wander. The system's architecture becomes a little looser, a little more prone to gentle surprises. Some of those surprises end at the white dwarf's door. Asteroids perturbed into new paths can pass too near. Tidal forces at those distances are surgical. Loose piles of rock, rubble piles, that have slept safely for billions of years, can be pulled apart, like bread in careful hands. The fragments grind into dust. A ring forms, tight and dim, lit by the dwarf's harsh light. Over years to centuries the ring drifts inward, feeding the dwarf a meal of metals. The star's spectrum shows the crumbs. We, watching from far future observatories, read the elements and in further stones, basalts, water-rich clays, the chalky signatures of carbonates, and we realize we are reading the ghost geology of an ancient planetary system. If Mars endured the earlier seasons, its circles farther out now, its year a little longer, its sun a point. Its red will darken as the day's spectrum shifts. Frosts will thicken. The brief spring it enjoyed under the red giant's honeyed light will have faded. It keeps time with gravity rather than warmth. Whether it carries moons after all that weather, Phobos Deimos, depends on ages of tides and fractures we cannot know from here. The inner system, once a busy place of rock and dust warmed by a loud day, is a museum of trajectories. Farther still, the large moons of the giant planets take their cues from the lantern hour now past. Europa's fractures refreeze. Enceladus's plumes settle and glass over. Titan's lakes hush beneath a colder sky. They had a brief story under a swollen sun. They returned to sleep under a small one. Yet the giants themselves continue to write gravitational music that sometimes pulls a small moon too close, or tosses a captured object into a family paint box. It is not quiet, just slower. At the edge, the Oort cloud, a vast, nearly spherical shell of icy bodies, has known the sun as a long, slow beacon. With the mass halved, many of its members find their bonds weakened. Some go their own way, becoming citizens of interstellar space, dark and indifferent. Others, disturbed by the galaxy's tides, or by a wandering star here and there, tumble inward for a last visit to the old home, becoming comets that draw thin white lines through the dwarf sky. Inward journeys are rarely gentle. Tides and sunlight remold them. A few break, a few feed the faint rings that sometimes halo a white dwarf. The system's periphery drifts toward the galaxy. The boundary between us and out there blurs. It is tempting to look for new warm places in such a cooled home. For a time, as the white dwarf cools through certain steps, there exists a narrow annulus, a radius where a rocky world could receive enough warmth to keep liquid water, given a forgiving atmosphere. If a planet could be placed there after the giant phases, perhaps by interactions among surviving giants or by the migration of a captured body, then a long, slow evening could be imagined. The light would be steady and small, the year short, the world likely tidally locked with one face forever in day. The twilight band between day and night, perpetual dawn, might become a country of its own. These are speculations to hold lightly and kindly. The early white dwarf shines too hard in ultraviolet. The late one dims too far. Atmospheres need tending. Worlds need to arrive unshattered. The story is not impossible, but it is delicate, and it belongs to readers millions upon millions of years downstream. What remains certain is that the white dwarf's gravity keeps a center, even dim, even small. It is a hearth. Orbits trace their ellipses around it with a slower grace, as though the music they once danced to has been replaced by a hum. In that hum, dynamical accidents still occur. Resonances drift. Secular cycles trade angular momentum. Inclinations wobble. Now and then a world might be nudged into a long lopsided path, then back again. Now and then a belt object might be fed to the ring. The coda has movement. If we ask where we would be in such a system, the kind answer is absent but not erased. The elements that once formed hands and eyes would have been long since reworked into other minerals, other soils. Pieces of us would be in the dust that drifts inward, in the ice that drifts outward, in the faint, faded glow of the nebula that once hung like a holiday in the sky. Our stories would be lodged in whatever minds might rise elsewhere, or simply folded into the galaxy's general memory, which is chemistry. There is, too, the Milky Way itself, leaning through this long after. The sun's neighborhood will have changed its companions. Nearby stars rarefy and gather as the galaxy breathes. In a few billion years more, our galaxy and Andromeda will have finished their long embrace, becoming a new city of stars. The white dwarf that was the sun will circle that new center among strangers, its rings and fragments, and little planets, if any, anonymous in a wealth of lights. The solar system's identity will be less a proper noun than a local weather pattern, and yet return just for a moment, to the image of the white dwarf as a bead of hard light. See in your mind a faint, thin ring. Perhaps a small rocky body wanders within that ring, humbling and undramatic. No atmosphere left, its path safe and predictable, tracing year after small year around a point that once filled the sky with noon. The feeling is not of tragedy, it is of quiet continuity. The score has moved into its last pages, but the notes on those pages are clear and particular. Let your breath find that clarity. In a slow arc outward, out, a slow return. After the music, the room is not empty. It remembers the song. Somewhere, dust is still settling through light. Somewhere, a distant comet is beginning a very long turn. The ember at the center holds, small and sufficient. There is a way a neighborhood remembers us, not in names on mailboxes, but in the way our porch light once brushed the leaves across the street, the faint glow that helped other walkers see their steps. Stars have neighborhoods too. Their comings and goings, their wins and endings, add up to a kind of communal weather, slow, generous, shared. When the sun finishes its bright, busy years and turns to the softer work of giving itself back, the solar neighborhood will notice. Imagine the region around us, the thin, starlit interstellar medium, as a breathing room. Here and there, cold clouds lie like blankets, rich with hydrogen, helium, and the trace elements older stars have contributed: carbon, oxygen, silicon, nitrogen, iron. Elsewhere, the gas is warmer and thinner, stirred by the faded shock waves of long-ago supernovae, by the breezes of giant stars still in their prime. The sun has moved through such rooms before and will again, orbiting the Milky Way's center like a city bus, finding familiar corners on a long route. The route wobbles, the scenery changes, but the rhythm remains. When our star swells and sheds, when it gardens dust into space, those grains will join this breathing room. Silicate specks, perhaps with a trace of iron, molecules laid down like frost in the cool outer wind, ions that will recombine farther out, where space is quiet. Each is a story. Some grains are resilient enough to travel far, surviving ultraviolet light and the occasional jostle with other travelers. A few will wander into cooler clouds and become the seeds of larger clumps, mantled with ices, water, carbon dioxide, perhaps ammonia, that form in darkness. Microscopes, turned on meteorites in our own time, have found presolar grains, tiny crystals that predate the sun, carrying isotopic accents that betray the furnaces they came from. In some future lab, somewhere down the spiral arm, or in a daughter galaxy of the merged Milky Way, Andromeda. Other hands might find grains that carry our sun's signature, a slightly altered oxygen fingerprint, a balance of silicon that leans our way. The neighborhood learns us by these quiet tokens. The shapes of the nebula we leave, its rings and hourglasses, its wisps, will expand into invisibility. Not lost, simply mingled, a passing star on a path written long before our own was named. May drift through the outskirts, gathering a little of our dust in its wake. A cloud, a dozen light years away, might, in a few million years, fold inward to make new suns. In one corner, a small clump will inherit a handful of our atoms and cool them into rock. Chemistry will remember us where history cannot. A lattice in a grain, a ratio in a gas, a faint bias toward carbon chains that like to grow. If we pan back farther, the Milky Way itself feels like a living archive. Spiral arms are not fixed rails, but patterns of crowdedness. Waves where star formation prefers to happen for a while before the pattern drifts. The sun has crossed such arms before, it will cross again, or perhaps by the time our nebula is a rumor, the arms will have become something new. In a few billion years from now, Andromeda will have drawn near enough that the two galaxies begin to weave together. Tidal tails, long graceful plumes of stars, will unfurl. The night sky from any world that still keeps one will grow strange and spectacular. Star formation will flicker in new places. The sun's ember, small and sure, will orbit within this merged city of stars, carrying with it a trail of dust and the after-image of an old lantern. The neighborhood is not only gas and gravity, it is also light as conversation. Planetary nebulae like the one our sun will make, are luminous postcards. Their spectral lines are readable across great spans, declaring quietly, oxygen here, nitrogen here, neon here. Astronomers on worlds we'll never know might include our remnant in catalogues, measure its expansion rate, infer its age. Once they might murmur in their own language, there was a sun. Perhaps they will trace back our motion. See the absent ring where the Kuiper belt used to sing, the thinned-out edge where an old heliosphere met the wider wind. To them, we will be a well-behaved example, a tidy lesson in how a G-type star exits. No supernova, no neutron star, no black hole, just patience. Sometimes the neighborhood plays a reciprocal part. The sun has not been the only author of our sky. Long before humans counted winters, a nearby massive star ended as a supernova, leaving traces in layers of ocean sediment, atoms of iron, with an extra weight that hints at an explosive birth. Such pinches of material have drifted across our orbit, like pollen, the local bubble, the warm, rarefied cavity our system now moves through, maybe the blown-out hollow of many such ancient fireworks. We have been living in the afterglow of others for a long time. When our time comes, our contribution is gentler, but it fits the same cycle: creation, sharing, remixing, creation again. In a quieter register, there is this: the neighborhood learns our story, because it is also the place our story learned to begin. Every chlorophyll blade, every hemoglobin breath, every clay tablet etched with weather and names, all of it came from the neighborhood's pantry. The carbon came from elder stars, the nitrogen from shells around quieter giants, the iron from catastrophes we are grateful to have witnessed only as gifts. We gathered these things and made weather and bread, poems and bridges. Then with kindness we put them back, first in small ways, returning husks to soil, later, if we endure long enough, as atoms to space. Picture, if you like, a future cloud. Cold, dark, a place where dust maps the slow drifts of gas, like flour maps a baker's touch. Within it, turbulence gathers knots. In one knot, our sun's atoms are not special, only present, like a few letters mixed into a paragraph. The knot tightens, a disk forms, planets accrete. In a young world's shallow sea, chemistry begins to argue with itself in productive ways. Somewhere a leaf figure learns to stand in light and drink. Somewhere an eye opens. The neighborhood has given our story new punctuation marks. We will not know them. That is all right. The comfort is in the continuity, not in the credit. Around us now, if you step outside and let your eyes adjust, the nearest stars are quiet lights, with their own rooms and worries. Some have planets arranged like bracelets, some might have none, some hold icy belts with comets that are learning their paths. We suppose with humility that many keep time with beings who tell stories at dusk. Perhaps they do not. Either way, the neighborhood holds them as it holds us, with tides that do not feel like tides, with light that feels like weather. And so the sun's last gift, beyond the ringed lantern and the lonely ember, is a contribution to the Commonwealth. Its dust will be a handful among many trillions, but every handful matters. You have likely seen dust in a shaft of afternoon light, turning a room into a galaxy of sparks. That is the scale to hold. Sitting here in the dark, small, present, beautiful in motion. Our dust will join the dance. Let your shoulders release. Let the imagined spiral of our neighborhood widen, and then blur like breath on glass. What matters is the sense that nothing is wasted, that endings become materials, that the street remembers your porch light in the way it made other steps safer. In the next chapter, we'll turn gently back toward ourselves, not to make plans with alarm, but to wonder about how beings like us might live alongside such scales, how we might carry humility into long thinking, how we might craft kindness into our tools. The star is patient, perhaps we can be too. There is a soft skill that evenings teach, how to recognize enough light to see by, and enough dark to rest in. If our species learns to last, to look up, not only with instruments but with care, perhaps we will become evening-minded in this way. The sun's long story gives us room to practice. Begin with a kindness. The time horizons that concern our daily lives are small. compared with the sun's. The choices we make about energy, food, and cities are written in decades and centuries. They matter deeply to us and to the living neighbors we share this world with. They do not bend the sun's arc, nor are they asked to. Let this be a relief. We can tend our rooms while learning to read the house. If humans endure, if our descendants become a chorus rather than an echo, our relationship with the sun will change from dependence to partnership, and from partnership to stewardship, tempered by humility. The early steps of that shift are already in the air. Literal solar light, captured on rooftops and deserts, mirrored in satellites that sip the day above the clouds. We are learning to treat starlight as a local resource, as edible weather. The learning is uneven and human, but it is a start. Beyond energy, there is the long practice of listening. The sun has moods on the scale of years and decades, the flexing of magnetic fields that sometimes wash our planet with gusts of charged particles. We have learned to anticipate these a bit, not with mastery, but with awareness. Power grids can be designed to ride the waves. Satellites can tuck themselves into safer postures. In listening, we replace fear with respect. Respect makes better sleep. Carry that practice forward. On the scale of millions of years, the sun grows brighter. We will not be the same species then. We might not be a species in any sense a biologist today would recognize, but if minds and hands remain, whatever their shapes, one can imagine a culture of gentle interventions, treatments not of the star but of the local light, a veil in space, sparse and wide, tilting to ease a summer into spring, orbits adjusted slowly with the gravity nudges of modest asteroids, trading momentum like dancers trade weight, letting a homeworld amble a little farther out over aeons. All of this is speculation, and should be held as lightly as a feather. It comes with ethics before it comes with engineering, an ethic that asks, does this kindness travel 7 generations, and then, if the answer is not trustable, finds a smaller kindness? Perhaps the future finds homes not only on a planet that warms, but in habitats that keep their own seasons. Rings and shells in gardens that sip solar wind and sunlight, arranged like lanterns in the dusk of orbit. Stories have been told about such places in 1,000 tongues. Some make them engines of conquest. We might make them instead cloisters of care, villages that tend a single grove well, cities that measure wealth in clean water and quiet corridors. Science becomes less a lever for moving the world than a lamp for seeing where to place the next step. It is tempting in speculative moods to draw grand blueprints, migrating worlds, star shades the size of countries, mirrored fleets that choreograph dawn. These can be thought experiments that teach patience. They can also become the kind of reaching that forgets to ask permission of the beings most affected, the forests, the microbes, the rivers. If we are still listening, our tools will be made to respect the small as much as the grand. A wiser future might privilege reversibility, modesty, and repair over spectacle. The sun will never demand drama from us. The scales involved do not insist on it. What they ask for is thoughtfulness at a tempo that honors their slowness. There are other paths. We might choose to dwell mostly in the outer rooms of the house, spread our possibilities among moons and minor worlds, where sunlight is softer and choices do not lean so hard on a single biosphere. We might learn to bank light, to grow forests in places we make from rock and ice, to cultivate night and day with shutters and mirrors. Perhaps if we are tender, we'll carry with us a grammar of Earth, its habit of watersheds and mycelial networks, its love of edges where 2 habitats meet and invent a third. If Earth remains inhabited as it warms, it will be because we learned how to leave it alone as much as we learned how to help. Alongside engineering, there is the work of meaning. The sun stages our days, but it also anchors our metaphors. We speak of clarity as sunshine, of bleakness as midwinter shadow, of generosity as warmth. Living with the knowledge of our star's mortality might press some minds into urgency. Let us soften that. The sun's ending is not a clock we can see. It is a horizon we can walk toward without ever needing to arrive. If we are still listening, we can turn the knowledge into a lullaby. We have time, it might sing. Use it kindly. Kindness. In this register has shapes, a school that teaches children how to notice the angle of light and how noticing makes better art and better crops. A holiday at first frost that honors quiet, a practice of stepping outside at dawn, whatever dawn means on the world, where you are, and saying a word of thanks to the fusion hearth that keeps you. Ritual is how knowledge becomes community. Communities held together by attention may find it easier to choose the long view. There will be temptations to impatience. The sky has always invited empire. We can choose to be small and good instead, to study stellar physics, not as a way to dominate, but as a way to belong. Belonging might look like restoring dark to places that need it, so that other beings can navigate by starlight. It might look like designing signals to future astronomers, simple, truthful, folded into the materials we cast off when we too, someday we were here, the signal could say. We tried to be gentle. In the very far future chapters, the red giant garden, the lantern bloom, the small white star, there may be minds who choose to shepherd debris into patterns, not for survival but for remembrance, a ring braided with deliberate gaps that spell out a prime in the spacing of stones, a faint lattice in the nebulous shell that draws a curve only art would choose. Or maybe the best memorial will be silence, dust well made and well given, no signature, only usefulness. Not every story needs a letter carved into a tree. Sometimes the tree is better off uncarved, and if we do not last, if our story ends sooner than we would hope, then we may still have been good ancestors by attending to what we could. We can leave behind soils alive enough to teach whoever comes next. We can leave behind structures kind enough to be repurposed, edges softened so moss and time can take them. We can at the very least leave behind fewer wounds than were given to us. The sun will not mind our absence or our presence. That is not indifference. It is the equality of light. Beneath the speculation there is the nightly practice we do together here, resting. Rest is the rehearsal for the long patience that stars invite. It is an ethic as much as a physiology. Close your eyes, and the day unwinds. Hold a thought in your hands, the sun warming a stone, the stone warming your palm, and notice how that thought cools. The muscles understand that cooling, the heart does too. If you are still awake, perhaps you feel an outline forming. The arc from our window to the star's ember is not a cliff, but a slope. On that slope there are benches. We can sit. We can learn to tell our children not only what a proton is, but why a slow process is often a wise one. We can place our tools gently on the table and decide to speak in quieter voices. We can plan without clutching. This listening includes the acceptance that we are not the sun's only audience. Whales have their own dawn. Beetles know a geometry of light that painters envy. In grasses, there is an intelligence of angle and hour. To be humble is to admit we are latecomers to a very old room, and to find a place on the floor where our feet can be still. So if we, or our descendants, are still here when the sun thins its envelope into lantern light, let us hope they will watch with the kind of awe that does not burn, only warms. Let them take care not to mistake brightness for importance. Let them write fewer slogans and more lullabies. Let them stand at the window and say thank you, and then sleep, and then wake, and help someone they know with something small. We are nearly home in this journey. One chapter remains, a returning, a gathering of images like shells after a day at the beach. The sun will take care of its own ending. Our work, tonight, is to rest inside the comfort of limits, and to feel how kindly those limits hold us. If you like, loosen your jaw. Let the breath drift the way stars drift through a spiral arm. Unhurried, sure, in the hour after company leaves, the house remembers, a faint citrus from a cut orange. The warmth where a chair held someone's weight, a murmur that is no longer sound, only the shape it left in the air. The sky has an after hour too, and the sun, our steady elder, will one day become mostly memory. A lantern faded, a small white ember cooling at a pace too patient for names. What remains for us, tonight, is the afterglow, the part of the story that lingers in the room when the telling is done. Let us return for a moment to the window. Outside, the dark holds quietly. The city or the countryside and their midnights wear different clothes, but both have a way of softening edges. Perhaps a streetlight spills a pale strip onto the sidewalk. Perhaps snow carries its own faint light. Perhaps there is nothing but the suggestion of trees and the hush of air. The sun is not here in any obvious way, and yet it is everywhere. In the wood grain of your table, in the color of the fabric at your feet, in the mineral line of a glass that catches the lamplight and makes something bright of it for a second, then gives it back. We began with the present day, a star keeping balance, gravity and heat shaking hands across a billion mornings. We watched photons start their wandering from the core, change directions until the journey forgot its own beginning, spill out at last across space to arrive at your window 8 minutes, and some seconds after they were free, we walked through granules, fields of rising heat as wide as countries, through the chromosphere's brief flames and the crown of the corona, where magnetic fields speak in careful arcs. We learned gently that time for a star is a conversation between mass and patience, that the sun brightens slowly, as if noon itself were learning a new word, that the stone in the yard knows more summers than we do, and could tell us if stones could talk, that each summer is measurable, and each change is still small enough to hold. We stepped forward into the hours when hydrogen in the core gives way, when fusing moves to a shell, and the star's envelope loosens, swelling like a sail meeting a new wind, Mercury lost to intimacy, Venus drawn inward, Earth's fate a soft maybe, hedged honestly, so far ahead that even the word continent will have learned different shapes. We felt the hush before the helium flash, heat climbing inside a stubborn core, the door opening not with spectacle but with decisiveness, and saw the sun grow briefly narrower in its stance, whiter in its light, a second youthful steadiness that would last long enough for mountains to grow tired of standing. We followed that steadiness into the asymptotic garden, where the star learns to exhale in pulses, where dust becomes currency and generosity becomes architecture. We stood within a lantern made of remembered breath, the planetary nebula, colors singing the elements that later teach comets how to sparkle and clouds how to condense. Then we learned the embers calm, a white dwarf held not by flame but by principle, electrons saying a quiet no that becomes a world-sized yes to structure. We watched orbits rewrite themselves after the music, rings of stone whisper inward and leave metallic fingerprints on a surface where gravity edits quickly. We panned out to the neighborhood, to the interstellar room where dust is both archive and seed, and felt how our sun would join the Commonwealth, its last gifts folded into future paragraphs the galaxy will write without us. If this feels like a great circle, it is because the universe prefers them, not perfect loops that return us to identical skies, but wide, gentle circuits where material and light, time and habit, wheel around and meet one another again in new conversations. Stars become dust, dust becomes stars, and in between there is room for seas and moss, for diatoms and whales, for infants who squint at bright windows and elders who lean toward them with a smile. Perhaps the tender question under all of this is not what happens when the sun dies, but what happens to us in the knowing. Do we clutch? Do we rush? We might. We are human, and urgency has saved us from cliffs before, but there is another way, and it is more suited to a star's tempo. Let the knowledge soften us, let it stretch our sense of enough. Let it teach us that the scaffold of our days is strong and slow, that we can afford to be kinder than the hour sometimes suggests. To feel this, you don't need a diagram, you only need the small certainties that your body already keeps. The way light in morning has a different temperature on your skin than light at 4 in the afternoon. The way a room cooled by evening invites quieter talk. The way bread warm from the oven carries a kind of promise that is not in the recipe, but in the time you waited. Stars are like that. Recipes and waiting, structure and patience, and the promise they carry reaches us even now in this ordinary dark. There are parts of the sun's future that science can only hedge. Will Earth be swallowed, or scorched and spared? Will a hidden companion, small and unremarked, carve a waste in our nebula? Will the white dwarf's atmosphere bear the signatures of our broken stones? We do not know, and that's all right. We have described the pathways that seem likely, the seasons that recur in stars like ours, the doings of neighbors we have watched long enough to trust. The humility of those hedges is not a failure. It is a style of honesty that has made our knowledge durable. Uncertainty, handled gently, is not a draft in the room. It is the room breathing. It might comfort you to hold one more circle. The atoms in your blood, iron, mostly for the carrying, were forged in deaths more dramatic than any the sun will script. The oxygen in your next breath was stitched in a quiet red clump long before our star ever formed. The calcium in your bones was born in temperature and pressure you will never feel. You carry within you the evidence that endings are not waste, but transitions. Whatever the sun becomes, it will not end in the sense that we sometimes fear. It will continue as material and as influence, as a dot of gravity, as a few lines in a spectrograph that someone somewhere will read and understand. And here, in this room, there is the simplest afterglow, the one we get to keep. We can choose to live with the sun as if it were a neighbor whose porch light makes us safer, thankful, respectful, uninterested in demanding more. We can choose to sleep in that light's rhythm, to wake with it, to notice it on the rim of a cup and the edge of a page. We can be, in some small way, good guests in a house warmed by a star. If you need an image to carry into sleep, let it be this. A window at first light, the glass cool to your fingertips. Outside, the roofs are stenciled in pale gold. A child walks a dog along the sidewalk. Somewhere a kettle begins to murmur. The photons that make this scene began their last 8-minute sprint. Not long ago, but their journey through the sun was ancient. They crossed a boiling interior where up and down mean heat and release. They learned patience that would shame a mountain, and then they came, not for you in particular, but somehow perfectly for you, because you are the one standing at the window, breathing, seeing, being. Or, if you prefer, carry the lantern's ghost, a ring in the sky, bright enough to wake colour from gas made of farewell. Not an omen, only a page in a book. Galaxies pass from hand to hand, the white dwarf at its centre, small, exact, enough. The space around it scattered with careful dust that will soon be ordinary again, which is to say extraordinary in the right light. Or simply carry the stone in the yard, warming each noon and releasing its warmth each dusk, a lesson in giving and letting go that lies under the open air as unassuming as a doormat. We are ending, but we are not finished. The sun will take care of its own long closing. Our work tonight is gentler, to let the knowledge unclench the day, to let sleep do what it does so well, gather scattered thoughts and fold them into rest. Perhaps you are already drifting. Let the shoulders ease, let the tongue fall from the roof of the mouth, let the breath be ordinary, like waves you can hear but do not count. The star that made our mornings will someday become a small, perfect ember. Between now and then, there is time enough for love, for workmanship, for mending, for laughter that curls through rooms and makes little galaxies of dust dance in the light. There is time enough, even for new kinds of attention, ways of seeing that make the familiar feel newly precise and the vast feel newly kind. Thank you for walking the long arc with me. Close the window if you like, or leave it open a finger's width to let the night speak. The sun will rise, as it always has, and the world will be exactly itself.